Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf, and today I am starting off my House of Burgess read-along series with a review and discussion of A Clockwork Orange. So in my announcement video for the House of Burgess, which got taken down by YouTube for the introduction that I did, the general premise of this series is to read a bunch of Anthony Burgess books to find out if he is more than A Clockwork Orange, which is pretty unarguably his most popular work today. And from what I've gathered from Anthony Burgess fans, largely they don't consider Clockwork Orange to be his best work. So logically, we are starting with A Clockwork Orange and then moving on to his other works from there. So A Clockwork Orange is his most famous work because of the Stanley Kubrick adaptation, but first I want to talk about the book itself. It follows Alex DeLarge, who is a 15-year-old growing up in a dystopian society. He has three companions in his gang, and together they go around at night terrorizing normal people with either murder, rape, or assault. It is written from Alex's perspective, and through his witnessing of the violence, you get his ideas, his interpretation of what's going on, and the violence itself is written in a somewhat comical way. But as the book goes on, his companions sort of start to betray Alex, and during what Alex assumes is another typical raid on a house, they betray him, they call the authorities secretly, and he is arrested, and he's brought to an institution where, again, he is framed for a murder of another prisoner, and he's forced to go through a series of tests orchestrated by government officials to see if they can turn this violent man into a normal citizen. And these tests include watching a series of horrifically gruesome tapes, and for the most part, the trials do work, and Alex, as a result of these tests, isn't so much seeing the value in doing good deeds as he is completely detested by doing morally bad things due to the videos. The book basically ends with him finding a new gang. He sort of wants to go back to his old violent ways, so the tests didn't really last as long as the government expected. He wants to go back to his old ways, and he gets into another altercation where he is thrown into prison, and he's basically using as a puppet for the government to show that the tests still work even though they don't. And in another scene in the Kroger Milk Bar, mirroring the first scene, he's with a new batch of gang members who are a lot younger than he is, and at some point he just grows tired of the violence. He meets one of his old gang members who now has a family, who now is about to be married and is an adult, and he sort of is thinking, sort of becomes embarrassed by himself as he notes that one of his heroes, Mozart, was 18 when he composed some of his greatest works, and that sort of revelation is what motivates him to grow up, basically, and to start living a normal life. Ultimately, it is a somewhat optimistic ending to this character who, at least at the start, is grotesquely violent. Part of why I chose Burgess is because he was a huge fan of James Joyce's works, mainly his stream of consciousness writing style. I read Clockwork Orange 3 years ago, and I loved it, but now rereading it, having read Joyce's works, I can clearly see the stream of consciousness style that Joyce had being an inspiration here. Clockwork Orange is reasonably shorter than a lot of Joyce's works, and the character of Alex is not like any of Joyce's characters. He's very violent, but at the same time, you get that connection to a character that you don't normally get with regular writing styles that are not stream of consciousness. I think back to Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom, who are some of the most well-realized characters of all time in literature because of that conscious writing style. You're always in their heads. Same thing can be said with Alex DeLarge. You're in his head, and despite all the grotesque things he does, at the same time, you somewhat sympathize with him, or at least relate to him in a certain way, because you figure out why he's doing things, and he's weirdly charismatic in his violence and in his convictions, and you also get his love for music as well. So he's not just a one-dimensional character, he's very fully fledged, and you sort of think that he's more of a product of his society rather than just an inherently bad person. So I want to first start off with the backstory for A Clockwork Orange. The story was birthed by an unfortunate incident that happened with Burgess and his wife. His first wife living in Brighton, which is a city in the south of England, which I've been to. She was walking home and she was assaulted by teenagers, which at the time in Britain was a huge problem with unruly teenagers breaking the law. And she was pregnant at the time, and the assault forced her to miscarriage. And that scene is emulated in A Clockwork Orange. And that tragedy hit Burgess really hard, and that's what started Clockwork Orange. And also at the time, he was diagnosed with cancer, and he thought he was going to die. So he, along with Clockwork Orange, he wrote multiple other works, all in a very short period of time, to give his wife books to sell after he's gone. But it turns out that he recovered from the cancer, and he ended up outliving his first wife by many years, and, sort of weird dramatic irony there. But this book was rushed and was written in a very short period of time, but you wouldn't know based on the quality of the book itself. So speaking of that scene, one of the first scenes in A Clockwork Orange where you see the true cruelty of what Alex DeLarge and his Drugs can do is a scene where he invades a home, and there's a writer there who is the Burgess stand-in, and before things get too violent, Alex talks to this writer, and he finds that he's writing a manuscript called A Clockwork Orange, and I want to read that passage as followed. "It is a book," I said. "It's a book what you are writing." I made the old Golas very coarse. I have always had the strongest admiration for them, as can write books. Then I looked at his top sheet, and there was the name, A Clockwork Orange. I said, "That's a fair, gloopy title. Who ever heard of A Clockwork Orange?" Then I read a melancholy bit out loud in a sort of very high-type preaching Golas. The attempt to impose upon man a creature of growth, incapable of sweetness, to ooze juicily at the last round the bearded lips of God, to attempt to impose, I say, laws and conditions appropriate to a mechanical creation. Against this, I raise my sword pen. So here you get Burgess's first attempt at discussing morality in A Clockwork Orange, which, funnily enough, comes from the writer character, the Burgess stand-in himself. And this scene digresses into Alex and his Drugs beating the writer and then assaulting and raping the writer's wife, which eventually results in her death. Burgess's wife in real life didn't die from this assault, but the parallels are very strong and very tragic. Interesting enough, the writer character comes back towards the end when Alex is quote-unquote recovered from his time in prison and through the trials he goes through, and the writer doesn't recognize him at first. Alex talks to him and he finds out the wife did eventually die from everything that happened, and the writer himself has aligned himself with another political faction in Britain, in this dystopian society, who are trying to prove that these trials do not actually work on people, and that forcing these trials is ultimately inhumane because people themselves seem to discover morality. It can't be forced upon them. And that's what eventually makes Alex so crazy and end up going to the hospital after he tries to kill him, after he tries to jump out of a window to escape the sounds of Beethoven. They sort of briefly mention the author character at the end, how he's very upset at everything that happened and he's not really getting any sort of vindication from any of the justice that's been done to Alex. So again, it's Burgess himself basically saying that he's not happy. He's not happy with anything that happened. That's government interference and prison time for the people who potentially assaulted his wife is not vindication for him. He's still miserable, but ultimately he's discarded because it's not in the government, in the book, it's not in the government's best interest to help the victim of the crime, but to make a grand political statement that they can cure violence. So talking more about violence in A Clockwork Orange, in the introduction of this book by Blake Morrison, he goes into great detail as to the political landscape of what Burgess was thinking with regards to the nature of violence, how it's caused, and how it's cured. And in this passage he says, "He, that is Alex, becomes a pawn in a political struggle between government and opposition. The Augustinians in power, who use him as a guinea pig for their experiment in human conditioning, and the seemingly liberal but no less ruthless Pelagians, who want to parade him as a victim of government tyranny. The distinction here was one Burgess had often made himself. St. Augustine thought that man is born in original sin. The monk Pelagius denied the doctrine. Alex is too brutal to be wholly sympathetic and too strong to be a victim, but like many rebel heroes, he exudes diabolic charm." So as I said earlier, the desire behind the government to cure Alex is not so much a need to see growth in the society as it is to make a political statement that morality can be changed through brute scientific force and experimentation. But Burgess himself is extremely against this, as you'll see in the end of A Clockwork Orange. The trials work very temporarily on Alex. And there's a quote from the character in the book named Dr. Brodsky, which I think really summarizes the intent behind the government here. "Our subject is, you see, impelled towards good by paradoxically being impelled towards evil. The intention to act violently is accomplished by strong feelings of physical distress. To counter these, the subject has to switch to a diametrically opposed attitude. Any questions?" "Choice," rumbled the rich, deep Golas. "I viddied it belonged to the prison Charlie. He has no real choice, has he? Self-interest, fear of physical pain, drove him to that grotesque act of self-abasement. Its insincerity was clearly to be seen. He ceases to be a wrongdoer. He ceases also to be a creature capable of moral choice. These are subtleties, like smiled Dr. Brodsky. We are not concerned with motive, with the higher ethics. We are concerned only with cutting down crime. And, chipped this bullshit well-dressed minister, with relieving the ghastly congestion in our prisons. So further backs up the point that Burgess is making, that governments in A Clockwork Orange and in British society at the time are not so much concerned with the people. Reducing crime statistics, reducing prison population statistics is the priority here, and there's nothing else to deny that. And you'll even see later on that once Alec is out of the prison and before he meets his old Drew Pete, he also, who is the one who reformed his life and is now going to be married, he also meets one of his companions, Dim, who was the dumbest one of the group and the most brutish one of the group. He's working for the police now, and it shows that governments in this time are trying to find violent people to enact justice in their society. So it isn't really so much concern of teaching people to do right from wrong as it is taking people and using them for the government's best interest. And finally, on this note of violence, I'm going to talk about the Stanley Kubrick film. Burgess is very much opposed to the movie, I think mainly because it overshadowed the rest of his works, but he also has some other valid criticism towards the movie itself, mainly in its portrayal of violence, which Burgess himself says glorifies violence, which is interesting because, for the most part, the violence that happens in Clockwork Orange book happens in Clockwork Orange the movie, but it is mainly about how the violence is portrayed. So I will read a section from Clockwork Orange, the book, and how it portrays violence. I had a real horror show smack at that, videoing that she had in her veiny rucker a crappy wood walking stick, which she raised at me threatening. So making with my shiny zoobies, I idiot a bit nearer to her, taking my time, and on the way I saw, on a like sideboard, the loveliest melancholy vesh any Malchik fond of music, like myself, could ever hope to vidi with the own two glasses. For it was like the Gulliver of Plechos of Ludwig van himself, what they call a bust, a like stone vesh with stone long hair and blind glasses, and the big flowing cravat. I was off for that right away, saying, well, how lovely and all from me, but idioting towards it with my glasses like full on it and my greedy rooker held out. I did not see the milk saucers on the floor, and into one I went and sort of lost balance. Whoops, I said, trying to steady, but this old Batista had come up behind me, very sly and with great scoriness, with her age, and then she went crack crack on my Gulliver, and with her bit of a stick. So I found myself on my ruckers and knees trying to get up and saying, naughty, 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 and then she was going crack 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 again, saying, wretched little slummy bedbug breaking into real people's houses. I didn't like this crack crack egra, so I grasped hold of one end of the stick as it came down again, and then lost. And then she lost her balance and was trying to steady herself against the table, and then the tablecloth came off with a milky jug and a milky bottle going all dunk, then scattering with splosh in all directions. And then she was down on the floor, grunting, going, blast you, boy, you shall suffer. Now all the cats were getting spoogy and running and jumping in a like cat panic, and some were blaming each other, hitting out cat Tulchuks in the old Lappa of Ptah and Grr and Clark. I got up on my nogas, and there was this nasty, vindictive starry Forella with her waddle a shake and grunting as she tried to lever herself up from the floor, so I gave her a melancholy fair kick in the litso, and she didn't like that, crying wah, and you could vidi her veiny mottled litso going purple where I landed the old noga. As I stepped back from the kick, I must have trod on the trail of one of these dratsing, creeping pusspots, because I slooshed a grumpy yow and found that fur and teeth and claws had fastened themselves around my leg, and there was a cursing away and trying to shake it off, holding the silver Malinki statue, one rooker, and trying to climb over this old Batista and the floor to reach lovely Ludwig van, and frowning like stone. And then I was into another saucer brimful of creamy Molokunir went flying again, and the whole vesh came, a very humorous one, if you could imagine it, slew chatting to some other vec and not your humble narrator. And then the starry Batista on the floor reached over all the dratsing yowling cats and grabbed my noga, still going wah at me, and my balance being a bit gone, I went really crash this time on the sploshing Moloko and striking Koshkas, and the old Forella started to fist me on the litso. both of us being on the floor creaking, thrash him, beat him, pull out his fingernails, the poisonous young beetle addressing her pussycats only, and then, as if obeying this old Batista, a couple of Koshkas got on to me and started scratching like Bazumni. So then I got real Bazumni myself, brothers, and hit out at them. But this old babushka said, "Toad, don't touch my kitties," and like scratch my litsa. So then I screeched, "You filthy old Sumka," and upped with the little monkey like silver statue and cracked her a fine fair Tolchik in the Gulliver, and that shut her up, real horror show and lovely. So the scene itself is a grotesque portrayal of violence, but the way it's written, and mainly the what the woman is saying, and not really the dialogue of the woman is not really realistic to like probably what someone would do if they were being assaulted by a gangster, basically, and the cats attacking adds a bit of comedy and like absurdity to the scene that's going on, and it somewhat mirrors the Stanley Kubrick attack scene without the cats because they wouldn't be able to choreograph that, obviously. But Burgess said that he decided that one of his intentions in using Russian words in A Clockwork Orange was to sort of blur the violence a bit for English-speaking or non-Russian-speaking listeners or readers. That was sort of a way of toning down the violence. So instead of saying like head, they have another word for head, or like different body parts or blood is krovi. So it does sort of take you a little bit out of the violence going on. Whereas the Stanley Kubrick film, it is not written, so you're actually watching the violence itself unfold. And to a certain extent, I understand what Burgess is saying here. When you watch A Clockwork Orange, especially this scene, there is a lot of comedy to it, but the fact that you're literally watching a woman get murdered by blunt force trauma, despite the fact that Alex is using a giant prosthetic penis as the weapon, it's still someone getting murdered by being hit in the head by an object, and there's no real, it sort of lacks the absurdity that's in the book that I think literature is, as a form, is able to relate, is able to convey better than in a movie, especially in this scene. So I understand where Burgess is going here, saying that Kubrick glorifies violence more than he does, and that would also lead me to the last chapter of Clockwork Orange. So the last chapter of A Clockwork Orange is the chapter which I've talked about multiple times already, where Alex is walking around, he's with his new gang, and there's just something off about it. He doesn't really want to go out and commit violence, and then he meets first his old droog, Tim, who's the police officer, and then his old droog, Pete, who is the one who's getting married, and he sort of has this revelation where he doesn't want to commit violence anymore, and that scene is left out of the Kubrick book, and that's partially because this scene is not in the US version of Clockwork Orange, at least when it was originally printed, and there's a reason behind this. In the introduction, it notes that Burgess portrays himself as an Alex-like pawn, caught up in a political struggle that went way beyond commercial publishing. My book was Canadian and accepted the notion of moral progress. What was really wanted was a Nixonian book with no shred of optimism in it. So the U.S. Publishing companies purposefully want to not include the last chapter because they like the more dour ending of the second to last chapter. And going into government surveillance, government control, and especially these are very prominent topics in today with what the media shows us versus what is actual reality. It shows here that even in the books you read, government interference is there because they particularly wanted the U.S. people to feel sad, and they wanted to control books so that they could keep this dour feel in the U.S. climate at this time, which is really interesting and really sad, but it's not something you would think of with A Clockwork Orange. You think, like, every book that you read is probably in its most realized form, but that's clearly not the case here because they didn't want the optimistic ending here. So my last question, which I don't really have an answer for this book, is Alex redeemable? And I want, if you've made it to this part of this video, I want you to answer this question in the comments because I'm curious as to what you think. Because, as I said earlier, the author character himself in A Clockwork Orange, who is the Burgess stand-in, finds no vindication, no sense of closure from anything that's happened here. But Alex himself does find closure. He doesn't see the wrong in his ways. He more or less just says, I'm too old for this. He kind of gets, it's both a biological urge to settle down, but also sort of like a societal shame urge where it's like, oh, my friends all have jobs now, so I should get a job. What am I doing with my life? And that sort of like peer pressure urge is much more prominent than any sort of government test or influence they could force upon him. Going back to Burgess's points earlier, which I talked about how morality cannot be forced on someone. It's not forced on Alex. Alex grows into that morality. But at the same time, all the atrocities that he's committed, both in this book and probably in events before the book itself, those people get no vindication at all. And you'd have to wonder, maybe at some point in the future, maybe Alex will be on the bad end of an attack. But this isn't so much a damnation, I don't think, of teenagers as it is a damnation of governments and how they sort of force people into acting these ways, and they don't really have any right ways to control people in what is ultimately a humanistic way that actually promotes growth, more of just a force you into doing something to make our numbers look good. And that's ultimately the tragedy of Clockwork Orange, even though it has somewhat of an optimistic ending, which Burgess himself says it is more of an optimistic ending, so take that as you will. But yes, my question for you is, do you think Alex himself is redeemable and that the story ultimately has a quote-unquote happy ending, or a happier ending? Definitely happier than if it ended in the second to last chapter, but I think it's brilliant in many ways. So yes, thank you for making it this far. Next video will be The Wanting Seed, which don't rush on that. I'm probably not going to be reading it anytime soon. I have a lot of school reading to do, so I'll probably make another video at some point where I talk about when I'm going to start reading The Wanting Seed, but it will not be for a little while, I don't think. So yes, thank you for making it this far. Check out my other videos. Check out my Road to Ulysses series if you want to learn about James Joyce. And then check out my friends Colorless Wonderland and Drunzo and Film Frauds, which I will link in the description below. And I haven't plugged this for a long time, but check out my Instagram, which I will plug in the description below. I gotta get more onto that. I don't really post very often. But yeah, so thank you for making it this far. I hope you enjoyed the video. Put a lot of work into it. And I'm really excited to read more Burgess later on. So thank you, and goodbye.